On the art of expression. Everyone would read, with greater ease and pleasure, a book written in a legible hand. And so it is with a speech. Everyone would listen with greater ease to one composed in well-wrought and well-organized prose. So we must not say that there is no such thing as a faculty of expression. That would mark us out as lazy as well as ungrateful. Ungrateful because it scorns God's gifts, just the same as if one were to deny the value of the power of sight, of hearing, or of speech itself. Was it for nothing that God gave you eyes, and endowed them with breath so keen and refined that it spans the distance to objects and assumes their shape? Do you know of any messenger that's as fast or as accurate? And was it for nothing that he made the air between, responsive and elastic enough to permit vision to pass through it? And what of light, without which the rest would be useless? Was it for nothing that he created that too? So don't be ungrateful for these gifts, but at the same time, don't forget that there are others superior to them. Give thanks to God for sight, for hearing, for life itself, and the means provided to support it, like grain, wine, and oil. But remember, He has given you something superior to all these, the faculty intended to use them, to test them, and to judge their relative worth. After all, what is it that determines in the case of each of these faculties what value to assign to them? You've never heard sight speak up for itself, or hearing. Both have been appointed to be slaves, and subordinates to the faculty of using impressions. What other faculty do you consult to learn what each thing is worth? What faculty can be superior to this one, which employs the others in a subordinate capacity, testing and passing judgment on each? None of the others knows what it is or what it's worth, when it should or should not be used. What faculty is responsible for opening and closing the eyes, depending on whether or not it judges a thing worthy of being seen? Sight itself? No. It is the will. What opens or stops our ears, making us either receptive to a speech or unmoved by it? Not hearing. It is the will and the will alone. Well now, the will looks around and finds itself in the company of faculties that are deaf and blind, incapable of looking after anything except the business that they were appointed to care for under will's own direction. Only the will is discerning enough to look after them, in proportion to their value, and supervise itself at the same time. Realizing this, is the will likely to declare anything other than itself supreme? An eye, when open, has no option but to see. The decision whether to look at a particular man's wife, however, and how, belongs to the will. And the determination whether to trust what someone says, and then, if we trust them, whether we should be angered by it, that also belongs to the will. This faculty of expression and arranging words, if it really is a faculty, does nothing more than dress up and organize words on a given topic, the way a hairdresser arranges hair. But whether to speak at all or remain silent, and then, if the former, whether it is better to speak this way or that, and if this is or is not appropriate. In short, determining the right time and utility for every speech, all these are the province of the will. So don't expect it to come forward and vote for anything but itself. But what if all this is true, and the subordinate element could still be superior to what it serves, as, for instance, the horse to the rider, the dog to the hunter, the instrument to the musician, or a subject to his king? Look, what puts the other faculties to use? The will. What administers all of them? Then what destroys the person as a whole, sometimes by hunger, sometimes by hanging, sometimes by jumping off a cliff? The will. Is there anything in the human sphere, then, that takes precedence? How can anything subject to obstruction be stronger than something that is not? Now both the will and externals are fitted by nature to obstruct the power of sight, as well as speech and hearing. But what can obstruct the will? Nothing external. Only the will can turn back on and obstruct itself, which is why virtue and vice apply to it and it alone. Now let's see so great a faculty that one can put in charge of all the rest come forward and say that the flesh is the element that rules over everything. Such a claim to prominence would be intolerable, even from the flesh itself. Come, Epicurus, which part of you was it that was responsible for making such a pronouncement? Which part authored works on the end, on physics, and on the criterion of truth? Which part let your beard grow long, or describe yourself at the hour of death as passing a most happy day, which also happens to be our last? Was it flesh or the will? Only madness could get you to acknowledge any faculty of greater authority than the will. Or are you really that deaf and blind? Does this mean that our other faculties should be despised? Of course not. We certainly do not say that there is nothing to be used or gained apart from the will. That is stupid, besides being impious and ungrateful to God. Each thing must be given its due. Even a donkey has some utility, only not as much as an ox. There is some use in a dog, but not as much as in a slave. There is use in slaves, but not so much as in free citizens. There is use in them too, but not so much as in the people who rule over them. If some things are of greater value, however, that does not mean we should slight the contribution of the others. The faculty of expression has its utility, even if it is less than the power of the will. So let no one suppose that in saying this I am suggesting that you should be careless of how you express yourself, any more than you should neglect your eyes, ears, hands, feet, clothes, or shoes. But if I'm asked to name the greatest element of all, what am I to say? The faculty of speech? I cannot. It is the faculty of the will when rightly applied, since it controls speech as well as every other faculty, great and small. It is by putting this right that a good person becomes good. When its purpose fails, he turns bad. It determines whether we are to know happiness or not, and whether we will be on hostile or amicable terms with our neighbors. Simply put, ignore it and unhappiness results. Give it your attention, and your happiness is assured. Yet try to efface the faculty of eloquence and say that there is no such thing. This really betrays a kind of cowardice, besides ingratitude, to those who have given it. It seems to me that someone with such an attitude is afraid that if a faculty of expression does exist, we won't be able to ignore it. It's like people who pretend that there is no difference between ugliness and beauty. Seeing Thersites, then, affected people the same as seeing Achilles, and Helen made no greater impression than the sight of an average woman? That, too, is an ignorant and boorish attitude, characteristic of people with no power of discernment. They're afraid that if they begin to notice the difference, right away they'll lose control and fall under the sway of beauty altogether. The important thing is this: allow everyone their particular gift or talent, but step back and look at what it's worth. Then come to recognition of the faculty that rules them. Make that the object of your avid pursuit, and relegate the others to a secondary role, while still giving them what attention you can spare. Take the eyes. They demand attention, but not because they are of primary importance, but for the sake of what actually is. Because the ruling faculty cannot function as nature intended it, unless it makes judicious use of the eyes, in making choice among particulars. But here's what happens. People act like a traveler headed for home, who stops at an inn, and finding it comfortable, decides to remain there. You've lost sight of your goal, man. You were supposed to drive through the inn, not park there. But it's nice here. Look, there are plenty of nice inns in addition to that one. Plenty of nice resorts. But they are only way stations. Your goal was different: to return to your native community, help ensure the safety of the citizenry, then turn your attention to acting the part of a citizen yourself. Get married, raise children, and be prepared to hold the usual public offices. You see, you didn't come with the option of choosing one of those pleasanter places. You are meant to live and go about your business in the place where you were born and made citizen. Well, something analogous goes on in our school here. Since you can't make progress towards your ideal without the benefit of teaching based on the spoken word, and since the same goes for purifying the will and correcting the power of using impressions, and since communicating our principal doctrines requires the use of careful diction and a certain variety and forcefulness of style, some students become captivated by all these things and don't want to proceed further. One is captivated by diction, another by deductive or equivocal arguments, someone else by yet another's in of this kind. There they stay and rot as if seduced by the sirens. Your objective, my friend, was to see to it that you make natural use of whatever impressions come your way, that you do not fail in your desires or have experiences you don't want, that you never be unfortunate or unhappy, but free, unrestricted and unrestrained, in sympathy with God's rule, which you submit to cheerfully, at odds with no one. But through this is the goal you're given. Next thing you know, a turn of phrase catches your fancy, or a certain abstract propositions, and there you call halt and decide to pitch camp. You've forgotten all about your obligations back home, announcing, "It's pleasant here." Well, who says otherwise? But pleasant as a way station, as an inn. What's to keep you from speaking like Demosthenes, and still being unhappy? Or analyzing arguments like Chrysippus, while still uneasy, still subject to envy and irritation, still distressed and downhearted, in other words? Nothing. So you see, those inns were not without value, but your goal lay elsewhere. When I say this to some people, they imagine that I am denouncing rhetoric, or care in the presentation of principles. But I'm not one of those who denounce it, only the obsessive devotion to it, and making it the focus of one's hopes and expectations. If someone who advocates this view does his listeners a disservice, then set me down as one of the offenders. When I see that one thing is supreme and most important, I cannot say that something else is, just to make you happy.